more friends are coming. Everybody knows our role model Dane Jan and I. We have the pleasure to introduce the next panel. First of all, a little disappointment. Janet Braun-Lohe from Devonport, the German-American Heritage Center, last night wrote a mail that out of 10,000 reasons she cannot come, but I was on their board and I can play a little bit Janet in our panel. We have, beside Jan, two charming ladies, Tova Brandt from Elkhorn, Iowa, and Laurann Gilbertson from Decorah, Iowa. And Iowa, we will learn, is the center of the best museums in the world. And from the best museums in the world, we have the two very best, Tova and Laurann. So they will give us a wonderful introduction, overview, and with Jan, who will say a little bit about his cooperation with Tova, which had started 6-7 months ago.
I think so.
I had the pleasure to put Tova and Jan together. They are meeting here, and all of us will be part of future projects. So this is not only listening, we will be all active. Maybe Jan, you give a little background how you started contact and why you started contact with Tova.
Well, I didn't start the contact, you did. So,
okay.
Actually, it started in a quite funny way. There was, we had this theme day on immigration, where Yogi also participated at the Schleswig collection. When was it? In the month of May? Wasn't it? I think it was the month of May, 4th of May actually. And the local newspaper, Flensburg Revise, had a full-page article on this event. And for some reason or other, which they never explained, they decided to decorate this article with a huge picture of the Danish Immigrant Museum, even though this Immigrant Museum wasn't mentioned in the article. But I showed this article to Yogi, sorry. Yogi had the great idea, the bright idea, to send this forward, this article, to Tova. And that's how this connection started, actually. I don't think Tova had heard of the Schleswig collection before. So, and she was about to plan the big exhibition of focusing on the 1864 events, and I just said, well, maybe I could help you with some sources and some pictures and some other stuff. But I think I will say a little bit more of that a little later. Right now, I will actually ask Tova to make some introduction presentation, because I think that speaks for itself much more than the words I can say. And after that, I know that Laurann also has prepared a little presentation, which is, no, I won't say no more. Please, Tova.
Tova is the star now.
Yes, she is. Now, always.
Okay, setting up high expectations.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, it is very nice to be invited to share some comments from a related field, the museum field. I've worked in the museum field for about 15 years, and of 12 of those have worked specifically with ethnic museums. And so when Yogi first presented the idea that we include a conversation about ethnic museums in this conference, and then when, unfortunately, learned that Janet was not able to be here and that you would be represented by basically a Danish museum and Norwegian museum, it seemed appropriate to provide a little broader overview on this type of museum, the roles that ethnic museums play within the United States, and really looking at what kind of choices ethnic museums make in shaping the story that they tell for their audiences. So I want to give you some overall background and then some specific examples. Culturally speaking, the United States, I think, is, forget the melting pot, we're a salad bowl. And within the United States, these cultures contribute to the country, they adapt, they evolve, and each one seeks to tell its story to the next generation. One of the strategies that communities do this is by organizing a museum. And if you think about all of the town museums, professional museums, Every art form has its own museums, and I'm familiar with everything from the Mustard Museum to the Decoy Museum to the Museum of the American Cocktail. It should come as no surprise that in this environment of museum making, the United States has a wealth of culturally specific museums across the country. And within that, this includes museums of various immigrant groups, primarily from Asia and from Europe, Native American museums, African American museums, and religious history and culture museums. For example, Jewish museums where religious identity intersects with cultural identity. And on the bottom of the screen here, you see the Arab American National Museum, relatively recently formed in Dearborn, Michigan. The vast majority of culturally specific museums have been founded in the last 40 years. Vesterheim Norwegian-American Museum is a very different case, and I'll mention it later briefly, but then Laurann will address it in more detail. In general, ethnic museums are founded by members of the ethnic group with common motivations. And those can include the impetus to preserve their cultural story, to celebrate the achievements of members of their group, to maintain a unique identity within a multicultural society, to educate others about their own history and traditions, and sometimes to share that insider story with outsiders. We can see this motivation in the mission statements of various ethnic museums. I conducted an unscientific study of about 15 different museum mission statements and saw some clearly common themes. These are the verbs of those mission statements that appear most commonly: preserve, share, celebrate, inspire, educate. And the objects of those mission statements: culture, history, traditions, heritage, contribution. Note that these lists do not include the verbs collect, store, or keep as action words, or collections as the objects. Though museums fulfill their missions through collections and the proper care of artifacts, the broader purpose is better described by the words here. An ethnic museum usually has a lot of materials and activities to draw upon. Collection artifacts can reflect historical experiences or traditional culture or more recent cultural expressions. The picture here of the shoes is just a sampling of pieces from the Japanese-American National Museum, shoes worn by different Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans in different points of their histories. And that can be duplicated thousands and millions of times over. Activities and programs sometimes incorporate holiday traditions, such as the Lucia Festival at the American Swedish Institute that you see below. It can incorporate music and dance, such as this dance group at El Museo Latino in Omaha. Language activities, arts, food, and all of those kind of practices that can comprise a culture. And all of those mission statement verbs, preserve, share, celebrate, inspire, educate, those can be applied here. Museum visitors expect the museum to reflect an accurate picture of the traditions and history of the ethnic group. However, every museum has to make choices about what to collect, which programs to develop, and which stories to tell. It is the job of the museum to interpret, to take the thousands and thousands of individual experiences and make sense of them for people who may or may not be part of that story themselves. A museum must decide which artifacts will represent the stories, and which stories will represent the group, and sometimes which groups will represent the full range of the culture. This interpretation will be the foundation of many people's understanding of the cultural history and ongoing cultural expression. And therefore, it is important that a museum remains conscious of the choices it makes and how those choices will affect its community well into the future. Culturally specific museums are almost always founded by people who are active members of the culture, who are often children or grandchildren of immigrants. The museums, though, will outlast their founders, we hope, and they have to continually engage new generations in supporting the institution. So, founded by people who actively remember the immigrant culture, a museum must also meet the challenge of teaching and engaging later generations who have to learn about their ethnic identity. I want to share several examples of museums that have made choices with lasting impact on the institutions and their audiences. And if there's any one idea I want to leave you with in this kind of introduction, it's the idea that all museums make choices that impact the experiences of their visitors. The Museum of Danish America was founded in 1983 as the Danish Immigrant Museum. In fact, we only adopted the new name a week ago, so we're still practicing. The founding committee knew that they wanted a national museum, and they had several options of where to locate that museum. I'm drastically oversimplifying here, but the choice basically came down to Elkhorn, Iowa, a town with a population of 650 people, or Minneapolis. Minneapolis would have some obvious advantages of a large urban population, easier travel, access for tourists, and closer ties to potential corporate supporters. Elkhorn has the advantage of a lower cost of living, which would mean lower overall operating expenses, an established Danish identity in the community, thanks especially to the Danish windmill, which was relocated from Denmark to the community in 1976, and the chance to operate with, frankly, less competition from other tourist attractions. But ultimately, it was a choice between urban and rural. By choosing Elkhorn, the museum started with a closer link to the 19th century immigrant materials that were still in the southwest Iowa region. The challenge going forward was, and still is, to represent the coastal and urban experiences with as much strength. When the museum building first opened in 1994, the core exhibitions stopped at the 1930s. Visitors to the museum could easily conclude that there had been no significant number of Danish immigrants since World War II. Finally, in 2008, the museum opened an extension of the core exhibition that continues the story into the 21st century. As the museum celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, in 2013, we have become very familiar with the challenges of operating a national museum in a rural location. However, I think there has been a hidden benefit to our location, because we know we could never survive if we relied only on the local population for support. 650 people is not going to support a museum. Had we been, so we have to continually reach out and engage people in different parts of the country. Had we been in Minneapolis, we could have gotten away with focusing largely on the Twin Cities. As we are now, in every program and in every exhibit and in every initiative, we think about how our actions will affect audience members across the country. The various museums for Swedish Americans illustrate my point from the other perspective. The primary museums of Swedish culture in America are divided among 4 major cities: Minneapolis, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Seattle. This happened rather organically. I don't think there was ever some meeting of Swedish American leaders to say, okay, these cities get a museum and these don't. But they do communicate with each other quite closely and enjoy the acronym Swedish American Museum People, or SWAMP. In each of these cities, the Swedish Museum concentrates on the stories and experiences of Swedish immigrant and Swedish American families in their region. None of these museums claims to be the place where a national, comprehensive story is told, and none of these museums have collections that represent a broad national story. So if you're a Swedish American in Texas or California, is there a museum that wants to tell your story? Not really, not yet. On the other hand, there are several strong professional museums who each bring their own perspective to the Swedish American story, so that altogether SWAMP is a very active group with a national reach. I'm sorry that Janet could not be here today to discuss the German-American Heritage Center in Davenport. In the world of ethnic museums, I would contend that German-American institutions have much in common with the Swedish examples I just mentioned. Rather than one national collecting institution, German-American museums are found in Davenport, in Washington, D.C., and many German cultural centers and cities across the country that often participate in museum activities, whether it's exhibitions or they have collections as well. I know Yogi can speak more specifically about these two museums in particular. And there are also museums with a narrower focus, either on arts and design of Germany and Austria or elements of the Cold War experience. Another of the Iowa National Ethnic Museums is the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids. And my apologies if this is an older slide. They have since moved into an enlarged building about 4 times as big. It was founded originally by a local Czech-American organization in the 1970s and placed in a neighborhood of Cedar Rapids that had long been known as Czech Village. By the 1990s, it was determined that it should have a national scope, and so in 1995 they opened this large new building to tell the story of Czechs, Slovaks, and their experiences in America. They do not, however, see themselves as an immigration museum. Their mission reads as follows: we inspire people from every background to connect to Czech and Slovak history and culture. American does not appear anywhere in that. Their programs and exhibitions have emphasized the history and culture of Czech and Slovak peoples starting 1,000 years ago, so it's a broad scope. Their main exhibition gallery, a majority of the space is given to that European story, and they've developed wonderful relationships with the National Museum in Prague and other museums in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Their collections reflect a strong interest in the cultural materials brought over by immigrants or by individuals visiting the old country. This decision to emphasize the old country was very intentional, and it does make sense when you consider the many decades during which Czechoslovakia was part of the Soviet bloc and therefore considered on the wrong side of the Cold War. Americans of Czech and Slovak descent did not have many opportunities to publicly affiliate with their heritage. To do so may have inspired questions of political identity or loyalty. Therefore, the museum was founded at a time when Czech and Slovak Americans really did need to relearn and reclaim their cultural heritage. Now, the museum faces the challenge of balancing the European and American stories and presenting American cultural expressions that have changed and evolved out of Czech and Slovak traditions. Visitors are still largely unfamiliar with the history of the Czech and Slovak peoples, and so it's still vital to convey that narrative. But the connections to the American story and the ongoing evolution of culture will have to be woven into a new interpretive framework. The Japanese-American National Museum is in Los Angeles, and I think it is the best example I know of to show an ethnic museum that has consciously chosen to engage outsiders as a primary audience, those whose personal background is not Japanese or who have no personal connection to Japanese-American history. Their core exhibition tells the story of 130 years of Japanese-American history, from early immigrants through the World War II internment camps to the civil rights achievements of the later 20th century. But then they take the next step and use that story, especially about imprisonment during World War II, to make broader points about American democracy and citizenship. The mission, and I'm quoting here, the mission of the Japanese-American National Museum is to promote understanding and appreciation of America's ethnic and cultural diversity by sharing the Japanese-American experience. And they explain further that they believe in the importance of remembering our history to better guard against the prejudice that threatens liberty and equality in a democratic society. A selection of some of their temporary exhibitions illustrates this. Many of their temporary exhibitions feature Japanese-American artists or the history of lesser-known areas of Japanese settlement. However, some of their changing exhibitions also connect to their broader mission. Just in the last few years, these have been on view. On the left, No Victory Ever Stays Won, the ACLU's 90 Years of Protecting Liberty. In the middle, Mixed Portraits of Multiracial Kids by Kip Fulbeck. On the right, Fighting for Democracy, Who is the We and We the People? Earlier this year, they also featured Patriots and Peacemakers, Arab Americans in Service to Our Country. None of these exhibits is specifically about Japanese-American experience. Rather, they all point to the larger message that the museum is communicating to the general public. This museum also reached out in the wake of the September 11th attacks. They recognized that Muslim Americans might be discriminated against just as Japanese Americans had been after Pearl Harbor. And in light of that, the museum organized the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy as a resource space, educational space, and a forum for exploring issues of living in a democratic society. And that really works as an almost autonomous section under the larger umbrella of the museum institution. Museums of Jewish heritage have a special decision to make regarding their public hours. Do they follow the traditional rules of honoring the Sabbath on Saturday? And if so, how do they interpret those rules? A strict following of Sabbath rules would prohibit any business or commerce on the day of rest, which means no handling of money. But Saturday is usually a day when most Americans are able to visit museums. This highlights the question, is the museum about the culture or part of the culture? The National Museum of American Jewish History opened a new building in Philadelphia in 2011, right near the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. It received great fanfare when it opened, including a review in the New York Times, and the New York Times rarely looks beyond New York to discuss museums. However, when the museum first opened, many visitors were surprised that they could not buy tickets on Saturday. The museum was open, but you could not purchase tickets at the museum. From the website, in recognition of Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, tickets cannot be purchased within the museum on Saturdays. We strongly recommend that you obtain Saturday tickets in advance. You may do so here, online, or you may purchase them at the museum on an alternate day of the week during regular hours. A limited number of tickets will also be available for purchase on the actual Saturday of your visit in the Forst Building, around the corner from the museum on 5th Street, and at Independence Visitor Center located at Market and 6th Street, just 1 block away from the museum. This was understandably awkward. And so when I checked up on this last night online, I found no reference to this very awkward situation. Apparently the museum decided that they were alienating more people by following Sabbath rules than they would have by letting them go. So I'm pretty sure you can buy a ticket on Saturday. There are many Jewish museums across the United States, and they have each had to answer the question of how to honor the Sabbath. Some are closed entirely, others are open but have free admission. And at the Jewish Museum in New York, anything that works is closed or turned off on Saturdays, though the overall museum is open. From their website, this is their explanation. The Jewish Sabbath is a day of rest, a special time for spiritual enrichment free from the concerns of schedules, everyday work, and commerce. For this reason, interactive exhibitions and electronics, the shops, Cafe Weissman, and the children's exhibition will not be available.